Hello, everyone. Corinne Smith here, hiding behind the slides as we follow one of Henry David Thoreau's trips, this time to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in November of 1854. This is the farthest point south that Henry would ever venture. And except for visiting the Catskills of New York, it's also the farthest point west he had traveled by this time in his life. Now, how do we know about this trip? Well, Henry wrote down some of the details in his journal. So if you have a copy of his journal that's based on the 1906 Houghton Mifflin set, you can follow along starting with volume 7 on page 72. If not, no worries. I'll be quoting him from time to time. We also have evidence of his trip through letters and correspondence, as you will find out in a minute. It was the fall of 1854, and Henry's second book, Walden, or Life in the Woods, had just been published in August. Now he was being advertised as a lecturer, probably by his informal agent, Horace Greeley, in his newspaper, the New York Tribune. Thoreau got a few offers for appearances from Plymouth, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, even one from Akron, Ohio. That last one he turned down. Thoreau gave about 75 public lectures during his lifetime. By now, he'd given more than 40, so he was somewhere in the middle of his lecturing career. Didn't really like the experience much. He didn't like it as much as Mr. Emerson did. Still, it was something that was expected of him. And so he got a letter from William Brooke Thomas, chairman of the committee in charge of the lecture series at the Spring Garden Institute in Philadelphia. The Spring Garden Institute was a mechanics trade school that had started just 4 years earlier in 1850. Thomas was a successful businessman who had started out in flour mills. He was on the board of trade, was a founder of the Corn Exchange Association, and he was a director of Manufacturers Insurance Company. He was also a staunch abolitionist who helped to organize the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. And obviously, this image of him was taken years later, during or after the Civil War. William Thomas invited Thoreau to speak at the Spring Garden Institute. Now, this would be a pretty long trip for Henry because he would have to take the railroad for more than 300 miles to get to Philadelphia in southeastern Pennsylvania. If he said yes, what else could he see while he was there? Well, he somehow knew that the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia had a large and noteworthy collection of birds, taxidermied birds, of course, preserved. Henry had seen other natural history collections in Worcester and probably in Boston too, so why not? He agreed to go and give a lecture at the Spring Garden Institute in Philadelphia. And of course, he must have mentioned Thomas's letter, the upcoming lecture, and the trip to his good friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Turns out that Emerson knew of a contact person for Henry to meet in Philadelphia, William Henry Furness, who was the minister of First Unitarian Church in the city. Furness was a longtime friend of Emerson's. He had gone to Harvard. They had served as ministers at the same time in Boston. Furness moved to Philadelphia in 1825 to become the minister of the First Unitarian Church. He was known for giving passionate abolitionist speeches from the pulpit, so much so that he had to have armed guards standing next to him in case someone who was not of the same mindset got any ideas about using force to stop him from speaking. So Emerson wrote to Furness, asked him to show Thoreau around the city, said that Henry especially wanted to see the birds at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Furness evidently agreed to do this. Everything was set. On Monday, November 20th at 7 in the morning, Thoreau got on the train in Concord and started his day-long ride to the city of brotherly love. The railroads at the time were all separately owned and run. Henry would have to take 6 different railroad lines and 2 ferry boats in one day, making up to 7 transfers in all. So train lovers and historians, listen up, because from what I can tell, Henry rode the Fitchburg Railroad from Concord directly east to Boston, the Western Railroad from Boston directly west to Springfield, the Hartford and New Haven Railroad from Springfield south to New Haven, the New York and New Haven Railroad from New Haven southwest to New York, took a ferry across the Hudson River and a way train from that point west to Newark, took the New Jersey Railroad from Newark southwest to Trenton, and the Camden and Amboy Railroad from Trenton southwest to Camden. And then finally, a ferry crossing the Delaware River from Camden west to Philadelphia. Delaware River, of course, being that red line that is the natural border between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. In Thoreau's journal, he says that out of that whole trip, the pleasantest part of the whole route was between Springfield and Hartford, when the tracks followed the shoreline of the Connecticut River. That's still a nice ride today. He reached downtown Manhattan at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At 6, they headed west to Newark and into New Jersey. Now, you know, by this time it was dark. It was November. Remember, these folks didn't turn back their clocks to adjust for daylight hours. So it was dark by the time he crossed into New Jersey. And this was too bad, because Thoreau by this time was in the habit of botanizing from the train, writing down the interesting sights he caught glimpses of from the train windows, like we might do today as we drive along fast interstates. We see something and we say, oh, wow, what's that? Oh, and then it's already gone. But today, he wrote in his journal, when he tried to look through the glass at the New Jersey landscape, he saw only the glossy paneling of the car he was sitting in reflected out into the dark. When he reached Camden, he took a ferry to cross the Delaware River to finally reach Philadelphia. We can use a bridge at that point today, but no bridges stood here back then. It was 10 o'clock in the evening when Henry finally checked into the Jones Exchange Hotel on Dock Street, just a few steps away from the river. And his room cost 37.5 cents for the night, not including meals. He had been traveling nonstop for 15 hours. Today, you can probably make the same trip in 6 or 7 hours by car, depending on traffic and which interstates you take. I always recommend avoiding I-95 personally. And you can take a train today, although the route is different and more streamlined now than it was in 1854. The next day, Tuesday, November 21st, Henry was scheduled to speak at the Spring Garden Institute at 7:30 in the evening. That meant that he and William Furness had the whole day to explore the city, and explore it they did, from the Delaware River on the east to the Schuylkill River on the west. Here's a map of the 10 sites that Thoreau mentions or describes in his journal. Number 1 on the right is the hotel starting point on Dock Street. Number 9 in the top middle is the Spring Garden Institute. I assume that they did this tour in a carriage provided by Furness. He lived at Pine and 15th Street, which is a few blocks south of the number 7 on this map. And the number 7 here marks the Academy of Natural Sciences at the time. They could have done all of this on foot, but then Thoreau may have been too exhausted to read his speech that night. On one bright September day in 2015, I did it myself. I walked the whole tour following Thoreau's journal notes. So I know it can be done. Let's revisit what Thoreau and Furness saw in 1854 and what they didn't see. The site of Jones Exchange Hotel on Dock Street is now a modern franchise hotel that may change hands yearly, I'm thinking. So you don't need to see a picture of that. And as Thoreau says, the place is right across the street from the Merchants Exchange building. This Merchants Exchange building was built in the 1830s. It's the oldest stock exchange building in the country. It is now owned by the National Park Service. A few blocks away between 5th and 6th Streets and Chestnut and Walnut Streets was what Henry called the State House, Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was declared, he wrote. Now, you know that Henry Thoreau loved mountains. He loved finding the highest point in any landscape and climbing it to look out and to get a bird's eye view. So Where could he do this in Philadelphia in 1854, in this city of about 250,000 people? The top of the tower of Independence Hall. It stands 7 or 8 stories tall, including the bell room and the cupola. At the time, it was certainly one of the highest man-made points in the city, if not the highest overall. We know that Henry climbed it because he wrote in his journal, "The best view of the city I got." Now, today, the National Park Service does not let anyone up there, even if you explain that you're just following in Thoreau's footsteps. However, the Independence National Historic Park has a video posted online of what the inside of the tower looked like in 2011, just before it was last repaired and renovated. The link to this video appears in the summary below. And so you will get to see some of the basic foundations of the building and what Henry saw. Behind Independence Hall is Independence Park, and just a few steps away to the southwest is Washington Square, another park. Henry says that he saw both gray and black squirrels here, and that they were fed and lived in boxes in the trees in winter. Well, I didn't see any black squirrels. They've gone out to the suburbs, evidently. But there were plenty of gray squirrels here, and they can make and maintain their own nests and drays now. Thank you very much. They don't need anyone to make boxes for them. Henry didn't mention the sycamore trees, but there are some sizable ones in both parks. I measured one and did the math and figured out that it was almost 250 years old. So it was here when Henry was, a little smaller, a little skinnier. From here, Thoreau and Furness made their way across the main part of the city, passing lots of traditional brick houses and businesses. They didn't see most of the contemporary buildings that now line the main streets of Broad and Market. They didn't see William Penn standing high on top of City Hall in the middle of it all. That building and its statue weren't put there until the turn of the last century. Henry and Furness were aiming for the eastern shore of the Schuylkill River and the Fairmount Waterworks. You can see the main building in the middle of this old engraving. It was an early water treatment plant. It had mechanisms that pulled the water out of the river to supply the city's population. Today, it's a terrific museum. And when you stand on one of its porches, you can still see the dam in the Schuylkill. When you go inside, you can look through all the exhibits. You will learn quite a lot about how we humans have managed water throughout history. I highly recommend the museum. Back in Henry's day, the waterworks included a reservoir. You can see the main building again with a rocky cliff behind it. And then there's a flat area on the hill above on the left-hand side. This was the reservoir that held the water for the city on top of Fairmount Hill, on the highest natural feature of the Philadelphia landscape. But that's not what stands on this hill today. The reservoir is gone. You know what stands in its place? The Philadelphia Art Museum. The Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was built in the 1920s, right where the reservoir used to stand. And so you, on this side, you have the Fairmount Waterworks and the rocky cliff on this side of the hill. And you have the rocky steps on the other side. They say, by the way, that there are 72 steps. It seemed to me like I was counting more than 200. Anyway, Henry Thoreau must have climbed up here too, to the top of the reservoir, because he wrote in his journal, "Fine view from Fairmount Waterworks." And you know what? He's right. It is a fine view from the top of this hill. You can see the downtown core of Philadelphia. You know Henry, he was always looking for higher ground, always looking for a way to take it all in. While he was standing up here on the edge of the reservoir, he looked to the northeast and spied Founders Hall at Girard College. Unfortunately, when you aim yourself and you try to get this same view today, this is what you see instead. An apartment building stands in the way. Oh well. Something else that Thoreau and Furness didn't see. They also passed Logan Square Park, maybe even twice, marked on this map as number 4. And Thoreau wrote that they had heard that deer had been seen in this park. This would have been something to see for sure, because Henry didn't see or have any deer back home in Concord. We don't know how true this tale may be or when the last deer was seen in Logan Square. Nevertheless, the next stop for the two men was their main attraction, the Academy of Natural Sciences. The Academy was founded in 1812, and it's the oldest natural history museum in the Western Hemisphere. Again, Thoreau would have known this, and I think it was one of the factors that led him to agree to come to Philadelphia. Now, today, the Academy stands right next to Logan Square along the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and not far from the Art Museum. But this was not the home of the Academy in 1854. Back then, it was in a building that stood at the corner of Broad and George Streets, marked as number 7 on our map. George Street has since been renamed Sansom Street. And although I looked closely at the buildings around Broad and Sansom, I didn't see one that looked like this. So I assume that it has since been torn down. In any case, not only was the Academy the oldest natural history museum in the West, it was also the place where a new organization was founded in 1848, just 6 years earlier. And this was the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Do you remember the story of Thoreau's intersection with the group? Henry was invited to join the AAAS in early 1853. He voiced his opinions about it in a journal entry on March 5th. The secretary of the Association for the Advancement of Science requests me, as he probably has thousands of others by a printed circular letter from Washington the other day, to fill the blank against certain questions, among which the most important one was what branch of science I was specially interested in, using the term science in the most comprehensive sense possible. Now, though I could state to a select few that Department of Human Inquiry which engages me and should be rejoiced at an opportunity to do so, I felt that it would be to make myself the laughingstock of the scientific community to describe or attempt to describe to them that branch of science which specially interests me, inasmuch as they do not believe in a science which deals with the higher law. So I was obliged to speak to their condition and describe to them that poor part of me which alone they can understand. The fact is, I am a mystic, a transcendentalist, and a natural philosopher to boot. Now I think of it, I should have told them at once that I was a transcendentalist. That would have been the shortest way of telling them that they would not understand my explanations. For some reason, Henry waited 9 months to mail his response and rejection in December 1853. It was more politely worded than this. He gave as one of his reasons for saying no the fact that he wouldn't be able to attend any of the group's meetings unless they were in the Boston area. Now, when Thoreau and Furness arrived at the museum, they were met by botanist Elias Durand. He served as their guide to the collections. Elias Durand, probably more accurately, Eli Duran, had been born in France and began his career as a pharmacist. He had come to America in 1816, had been working for the museum since 1825. He knew plants best, but he also knew the museum intimately, and he showed the men the bird collections. Henry shares some of the background information in his journal notes, but he doesn't go into detail about how the birds were displayed. They may have just been pickled in jars, quite frankly. Today, the animals are taxidermied and exhibited in groups by common geography and habitat and are shown in the kinds of environments they live in. Henry mentioned seeing a moose here, and he may have been slightly amused that it wasn't as tall as the one he had seen the previous year in Maine. There is a moose at the museum today. Here it is. I kind of doubt that it's the same one Henry saw, since more than 160 years have passed. But even if this is the same moose, technically, not all of it would be the same. Check out this nearby sign. When it was discovered that another museum's moose had bigger antlers than ours, oh heavens, something had to be done about it. Academy workers replaced our moose's inferior antlers with a larger set. When the moose diorama opened in 1935, the Academy was the proud owner of the largest moose on display in North America, and they call it a Franken Moose. A Franken Moose. What, what do you suppose Thoreau would think of this? This moose has been improved, Henry. Back in the carriage, riding along the streets of Philadelphia, Thoreau was watching the trees, and he asked himself in his journal, what were those trees with long, black, sickle-shaped pods? Evidently, he didn't think to go back to the Academy and ask Mr. Durand what they were. These are honey locusts, Henry. Honey locusts, and they still line the streets of Philadelphia. They still drop their seed pods all over the sidewalks, and then people like me pick them up and take them home for some reason. Evidently, Thoreau had never seen any trees, any locust trees in Massachusetts or elsewhere. He doesn't mention them anywhere else in his journal or field notes. So this was a new tree to him, and that's why he had questions. Thoreau mentions St. Stephen's Episcopal Church on 10th Street. But what he writes is, I did not see Steinhauser's bird family at St. Stephen's Church. Well, Henry, here is the life-size sculpture that you missed. It was carved by German sculptor Karl Steinhauser as a memorial to the children of Edward Shippen Bird and his wife, Eliza Howard Sims. The couple had had 8 children, all of whom passed away before their parents did, sadly enough. Eliza commissioned this work for St. Stephen's Church after her husband Edward died. I did not include this church on the map because I wasn't sure Thoreau and Furness really got here. Maybe William Furness just mentioned the artwork to Henry as it was recently installed, or maybe they tried to get into the church and somehow couldn't. Nevertheless, this is the piece he was referring to. By the way, if you walk around Philadelphia to see these points for yourself, be sure to keep your eyes open for other treasures. I spotted this little rhyme on the outside wall of St. Stephen's. I wonder how they know this. It's fun stuff. It's fun stuff. It seems as though, according to Thoreau's Journal, that he and Furness then rode back to the hotel, passing market houses and also passing the building for the American Philosophical Society, which stands right next to Independence Hall. Thoreau writes that the American Philosophical Society is described as a company of old women. Whoa. Did Furness tell him this? Well, maybe he thought it was that way at the time. The society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743, and it's still a scholarly organization today. I doubt that the members would appreciate Thoreau's or Furness's characterization of them. Now, usually when Henry traveled and spent more than one day in a spot, he would stay at the same hotel. But for some reason, this time, for his second night in Philadelphia, he moved to the United States Hotel. So maybe he was displeased with the inexpensive Jones Hotel, or maybe William Furness convinced him that he deserved something better, or maybe his hosts actually paid for his lodging. We don't know. In any event, historical accounts seem to differ as to where the United States Hotel stood in 1854. It may have been in this row on Chestnut Street. At the very least, this second hotel may have looked like one of these buildings. As for Thoreau's lecture at the Spring Garden Institute, he doesn't write in his journal about his performance or about the audience at all. This school sat at the corner of Broad Street and Spring Street and operated here from 1851 to 1969 before relocating to another site. This building was torn down 2 years later in 1972. Today, this block is a parking lot, although there is a pretty cool mural painted on the building behind it. Now, as I said, Thoreau's second book, Walden, had been published 3 months earlier. He could have chosen to read from it to promote sales. His audience included abolitionists. He could have read Resistance to Civil Government or another essay about individual rights or the role of government in our lives. But no, he chose to read The Wild, which is the second half of the essay that would be posthumously published as Walking. Maybe he thought that these city dwellers needed to hear these ideas. So the audience would have heard statements like these. In wildness is the preservation of the world. Every tree sends its fibers forth in search of the wild. Hope and the future for me are not in lawns and cultivated fields, not in towns and cities, but in the impervious and quaking swamps. I believe in the forest and in the meadow and in the night in which the corn grows. Wow. By the way, lots of corn was grown outside of Philadelphia. What did the Philadelphians think of Mr. Thoreau's wild talk? Well, to our knowledge, none of the local newspapers carried any reviews of it. And the next day, Thoreau started his journey back home. This time, he took a boat up the Delaware River a few miles to Tacony and Palmyra, which lie not even halfway to that sharp northwest turn in the river just before Trenton. Then he took the New Jersey Railroad to cross the state mostly diagonally toward Newark and New York City. Now he could see New Jersey. And what did he think of what he saw that morning? Uninteresting except the boat, he wrote in his journal. Sorry, New Jerseyans. Henry Thoreau stopped in New York and visited at least one day with his friend Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, who also sometimes acted as Thoreau's informal literary agent. They went to the Crystal Palace and they went to the opera that night, and they probably had a nice visit. This could be a story for another day. Thoreau doesn't mention in his journal when he headed back to the Boston area or whether he took the railroad or a ship to get back there. In past times, he'd done both at one time or another. Maybe he just retraced his steps with the same train lines. We don't know. In the meantime, back in Philadelphia, William Furness wrote a letter to Emerson to let him know how everything went. And he wrote, I was glad to see Mr. Thoreau. He was full of interesting talk for the little while that we saw him, and it was amusing to hear your intonations. Wow, and that makes it sound like Henry and Emerson had the same accent. And then he looked so differently from my idea of him. And then he drew a little picture of Henry. Look at this little picture of Henry. That's a pretty good profile, don't you think? He had a glimpse of the academy, as he will tell you. I could not hear him lecture, for which I was sorry. Miss Carolyn Haven heard him, and from her report, I judge the audience was stupid and did not appreciate him. Oh my. Wow. Well, that's not good. Poor Henry. Thoreau continued to lecture a bit. His next appearance was on December 6th, when he took the train south to Providence, Rhode Island. And he lectured that night, actually in the very hall of the huge Union Station building. And this time, his topic was, what shall it profit? Which became the foundation for the essay, Life Without Principle. He would give that same lecture 2 more times in December and twice in January. After his Providence lecture, he wrote candidly in his journal about the experience. After lecturing twice this winter, that's Providence and Philadelphia, I feel that I am in danger of cheapening myself by trying to become a successful lecturer, i.e., to interest my audiences. I am disappointed to find that most that I am and value myself for is lost, or worse than lost, on my audience. I fail to get even the attention of the mass. I should suit them better if I suited myself less. I feel that the public demand an average man, average thoughts and manners, not originality, nor even absolute excellence. You cannot interest them except as you are like them and sympathize with them. I would rather that my audience come to me than that I should go to them, and so they be sifted, i.e., I would rather write books than lectures. That is fine. This course, to read to a promiscuous audience who are at your mercy the fine thoughts you solaced yourself with far away, is as violent as to fatten geese by cramming. And in this case, they do not get fatter. Wow. And that's Henry's word on lecturing at the end of 1854. As for the Philadelphians, William Brooke Thomas, the person who invited Thoreau to speak at the Spring Garden Institute, served as a colonel in the Union Army during the Civil War. He led the 20th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia at the Battle of Gettysburg and lived to tell the tale. Eli Duran had a long and successful career in botany with the Academy of Natural Sciences. He might have been a good person to maintain a correspondence with if Henry had had the inclination to do that. All accounts are that they did not. And William Furness served for 50 years as the minister of First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. He continued to be a staunch abolitionist for the rest of his life. 2 years after Thoreau's visit in 1856, he was someone who took in Senator Charles Sumner after he was brutally beaten in Congress by South Carolinian Congressman Preston Brooks. On at least one occasion, Furness protected Frederick Douglass from an angry mob in New York City. And in 1859, after John Brown was hanged for his role in the raid on Harper's Ferry, Brown's body passed through Philadelphia on its way back to his farm in upstate New York. It is said that the Reverend Furness personally escorted Brown's body through the city in order to protect it, and he gave a private service over it. He also would have had a lot to talk about with Henry, again, if they may have kept in touch, but they didn't. And Henry returned to his family home in Concord, Massachusetts. He wrote, he lectured, he took field notes, he traveled across New England, even made a 2-month trip to Minnesota and back. Alas, he did not gain fame in his lifetime. It's only been in the last century, especially since the 1960s, that his writings and quotes have become popular and in the mainstream of American culture. And this is the story of Henry David Thoreau's trip to Philadelphia in 1854. Thanks for watching. As usual, you can subscribe to this channel below, ring the bell for notifications above, or post a comment underneath the summary. I'm Corinne Smith. See you next time.